Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. It's been a little while since we've had a guest on, so as a reminder for previous listeners and a disclaimer for new listeners, I do not take a stance for or against a guest's political views or people they support, but this isn't going to be a partisan discussion anyway. Civics education in America greatly needs improvement in this country. Teaching civics and government and so on is a core aspect of this podcast, and several episodes have focused specifically on civics education and how to make it better. But while a lot of people would agree that it needs to be upgraded, there isn't necessarily agreement on what that looks like. So what are some ideas to explore? What should be in our civics curriculum? Well, that's what today's guest, Doug Addison, is here to talk about. Douglas is the founder and president of the Center for Free, Fair, and Accountable Democracy, CFFAD. The goals of CFFAD are to, 1, help Americans understand why representative democracy is precious, and 2, help them understand, protect, and improve the foundations of trust in our republic. And to do that, CFFAD has been offering several short courses on its website, each reviewed by experts on the right and the left. But I understand the organization will be making some changes soon, which I hope we can discuss in the interview. And previously, Douglas was an economist with the World Bank for 30 years. Now, let's help drive the larger conversation forward on what our civics education should entail. Please welcome Douglas Addison to the show. Doug, thanks for being here. How are you?
Good. We're in the middle of a heat wave, but it's nice to be inside with air conditioning. So.
I live in Florida, so it always feels like that's going on. But yeah, it's been brutal for a lot of the East Coast. But let's talk about things that are a bit nicer. So I like going back to where it all started with guests about what we're talking about. So generally speaking, why did you get into civic education and teaching people about our system of government?
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. Really appreciate that. And it's nice to share your passion for civics and how to make it better. And that's something to think about on this 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence. I mean, it's amazing we're doing this podcast on the day before. So I feel like it's very special.
Yeah.
I think there's probably 3 parts. I had fun thinking about it, actually. So I appreciate your question. First, going way back, I suppose I've always had an interest in politics. I remember I tried once to get my high school to adopt a constitution for its student council. I failed, but the passion remained with me. I checked in with them actually last year. They have one now, so maybe I had a small impact indirectly. I don't know. Yeah. Second, I did have a long career doing economics. I was marching all over the world, assessing how governments in developing countries use their budgets to improve the lives of their citizens or not. It was all economics, but I could see out of the corner of my eye that the governments that were more authoritarian tended to use their money less wisely, more corruptly, and that they were generally worse off, and their people were worse off than the governments that were more democratic. So as I was getting towards retirement age, I was also noticing, and this is maybe the third component, I was noticing that a lot of Americans didn't seem to be realizing how lucky they are to live in a democracy. A lot of things to complain about. But when you look at how the rest of the world is, I feel like we really are very lucky to live in a democracy. So by the time retirement came, I knew what I wanted to do next. And I started by upgrading my knowledge. I did a master's thesis after retirement, looking at democracy from the perspective of conflict and conflict resolution, which was very illuminating. And I learned that actually more than a few political scientists look at it in that light. And I spent a lot of time also just catching up on the Constitution and important documents like the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers and so on. So that's kind of my 3-part answer, how I got started.
Nice. And that is an important part you bring up. There is a lot to criticize that goes on in this country. And I think a lot of times people, unfortunately, or at least the loud voices, tend to go to one extreme or the other. You either going to be completely down on America and think like, oh, how could we be proud of anything? Look at all the things that America has done. And then on the other side, it's like, you can't criticize America at all because it's unpatriotic. And I don't think either one of those kinds of responses are helpful. You need to take the good with the bad. You have to recognize all the many things that have gone wrong, but at the same time, it could be so much worse, just like you said. I haven't really gotten to look a whole lot at other countries' constitutions, but yeah, it's amazing just the stark differences you can find in all those countries. Although they technically have a basis of law, some of them aren't really even worth the paper that they're written on, just because the authoritarian leaders just basically just do whatever they want. But let's talk about the work now of the CFFAD. So why did you start this organization? And although I talked about it somewhat in the intro, what are some of the things that CFFAD does and that can be found on the website?
Yeah. Well, so again, the main reason why we got started is because I and several colleagues that I made acquaintances with felt that most Americans didn't realize how lucky they are, and we wanted to remedy that. And when we started back in 2018, we started with two observations. First was that civics was oriented mainly around the kindergarten to 12th grade audience, and that audience was super saturated, really, either by in-school programs or nonprofits. You could think of iCivics, or you could think of the We the People program from the Center for Civic Education, and there are many, many more. So that's the first observation. But second, despite that supersaturation, every year you would see reported annual surveys that show that most Americans didn't really understand how our system of government is set up. Never mind why. We definitely wanted to try to tackle that. Our approach so far is we're still a fairly young organization. There's much more for us to do, but so far we've been offering short courses on government, what governments can do for us. You'd be surprised that a lot of people aren't even clear on that. What governments can do for us, an introduction to Congress, to the presidency, to the judiciary, to federalism, covering all those bases, some discussion of elections. And as you mentioned correctly, all of those courses have been reviewed by experts on the right and the left. We are overtly nonpartisan, but maybe what is important to note so far is that what distinguishes us from the traditional civics curricula, besides the fact that we're catering to adults, is that we're highlighting maybe a little more than most civics curricula would, how today's issues of trust and distrust between various political parties and factions, they actually have strong parallels to those in the framers' time. And we show how the framers used the Constitution to manage that distrust, and in particular, the distrust of government. The government in their day was well known for its capacity to do harm to ordinary people. And we show how the framers used the Constitution to limit that harm. Also, how the system changed over time, because it has a lot, and how those changes might affect our trust today. And we also get into the weeds maybe a little bit more than the K through 12 curricula would on how citizens can interact with their government. If you're a businessman fighting or hoping for certain regulations, where do you go? Who do you contact? It's more than just your congressman. There are a lot of important offices now in the executive branch that a lot of people don't know about. So we try to make those types of things a little bit more apparent for the adult readers. Hope that's a good answer.
No, it is. And it makes me think of when you were talking about the distrust in the framers' time and in the founding fathers' time. And that was something I discussed in an episode I made for the podcast a couple of weeks ago, basically about what would the founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution think about America today? Because you often hear so much about, and a lot of times it's couched in which political party is ruling at the time. But this whole, the founding fathers would be so disgusted with what's going on right now. And a lot of times Republicans say that when it's Democrats running the show, and then Democrats will say that when Republicans are running the show. And it's just a kind of it's a misunderstanding, I suppose, of history. You had so much of that distrust back then. Even Federalists and Democratic Republicans were constantly at each other's throats and thought the others were trying to destroy the country. So it's I believe this is one of the worst eras of polarization that we've had, but it's not the worst. I mean, there's been plenty of comparable ones. And then you, of course, have the Civil War, where we were quite literally, as much as I hate using that word, quite literally two different countries because of how much we distrusted each other. So that part in particular resonates with me. And I definitely want to get a little bit more into some of those, more specifically about some of those courses. But like we said at the beginning, one of your organization's goals is to help Americans understand why representative democracy is precious. Do you think that that is something that is missing from civics education, where like it's just basically treated as a given, maybe? And how does this recent public opinion polling on the negativity about democracy and support for authoritarianism affect that goal?
Yeah. So is it missing that democracy is precious in most civics curricula? In a sense, on the one hand, there are civics curricula that sort of focus on American exceptionalism, and maybe there's a presumption there that democracy, American democracy, is valuable, is precious. But I don't know that even the exceptionalist school spells it out quite the way that I would hope for. And my board members, I think in general, it's missing. In general, I think most civics content is created on the assumption that the U.S. system of government is permanent and ever improving. People talk about American democracy as an idea, as an aspiration, so that it's something that's always improving. And if that's true, there's little need to explore why democracy is better than anarchy or authoritarian alternatives. I think about the defeat of Nazism in World War II and the collapse of communism, and I think to some extent they've been misinterpreted to mean that there's no serious competition to democracy. And in fact, the end of World War II saw the consolidation of the Soviet dictatorship, and even the collapse of that system in 1991 did not mean the end of authoritarianism and autocratic regimes. You know, the most obvious examples are the People's Republic of China and North Korea, but there are little autocracies scattered all over the world. So perhaps there's more to it than an exceptional system of government that's permanent and ever improving. Maybe it's important to explore why democracy is better, and that could be added to the other jobs of civics to explain the history of our government and how it works and our liberties, rights, and obligations. So let's link that into your other question. You mentioned recent polling on attitudes about democracy and authoritarianism. For us in our organization, the situation is quite concerning. Published survey data show that the support for representative democracy has been declining for decades. This is not a new problem. It's been going on for at least 30 years. And at the same time, a lot of people are increasingly tempted by authoritarian alternatives. Can I throw just a few numbers at you?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So these are from the World Values Survey and a survey by ActiveVote. So in 1995, 24% of Americans who were polled supported a strong, unrestrained leader, somebody who was unrestrained by Congress or the courts. And by 2017, that had increased to 37%. That's a lot. And this smaller ActiveVote survey maybe give it a little margin of error, but in 2025, that percentage increased to 40%. Even if it stayed at 37%, that's too much. For us, that we think that reality ought to be setting off a 3-alarm fire in the civic education community. I mean, what if our system of government is not permanent after all? And how are citizens to fully understand how much they risk giving up by supporting authoritarian and autocratic tactics? when no one's teaching them the pros and cons of authoritarian government versus democracy, and when no one's teaching them what authoritarian tactics look like. Good news is our research shows that a lot of the people tempted by authoritarian options are actually ambivalent between democracy and autocracy. And we find that this ambivalence is present in both major parties. It's not that you can point the finger at one or the other. In fact, typically what happens is people's support for democracy increases when their opposition is in the White House. Yeah. And their support for autocratic options increases when their party is in control. Why can't we just get things done? Let's get rid of these rules that get in our way. It's almost natural, right? So one of the changes that we'd like to make in our work and that we'll be focusing on over the next couple of years is trying to address that ambivalent audience more directly and trying to help them conclude in favor of American democracy. So there you go.
Yeah, that's the funny thing about authoritarianism and democracy, or when you're talking about certain rules for the quote unquote the other side versus your side, you're a lot more wanting restrictions on how government works when it's people who don't do what you want to do, and then when it is people that do what you want to do, then all of a sudden you're like, just let them do whatever they want. It's always funny how that works, right? And I think this might be reading into things too much, but I think part of that is that it does feel like there's less empathy and ability for people to put themselves in other people's shoes, at least when it comes to politics, and try to see why people feel the way they do. And a while ago, I had an episode that talked about efficient versus deliberative democracy. It was kind of a workshopping idea, and it's not a new concept. I don't know if it's necessarily been worded the same way that I thought of it, but it's that whole tug and pull between, do you want a government that is quick to get things done but maybe doesn't think all things all the way through, or do you want a government that is more pensive but there's a pressing issue that needs to be taken care of and you might not necessarily have the time? And it talked about it in all sorts of different contexts of government powers and so on, and it's one of those things that's not easy to answer, but I do wish that more people realize the ambivalence. Like you said, I would even go so far as to call it hypocrisy for some people, as to say, well, if our person's in the White House and they run the government, we like authoritarianism more. It's one of the prime examples I think of is support for the filibuster. I'm not going to name names, but I can definitely think of both Democrats and Republicans that have flipped the switch on whether they support the filibuster in the U.S. Senate, and it just so happens to be conveniently based on whether their party controls the U.S. Senate at that point. When your party doesn't control the U.S. Senate, the filibuster is the greatest thing ever. When you do control the U.S. Senate, suddenly the filibuster is a scourge that needs to be eliminated. And it's just a shame that some people are just so blinded by their partisanship and ideology that they'll sometimes be completely willing to be so hypocritical about it. But one of the other things I mentioned about CFFAD is that you guys work to help Americans understand, protect, and improve the foundations of trust in our republic. So how do you guys do that? And why do you think there is such a lack of trust in American political institutions? And how do we go about fixing that?
Right. Those are pretty big questions.
Yeah, definitely.
On your first question, I think we'd like to do better. We know that there's more that we could be doing, but thus far, we've been using our rather small advertising budget to reach out to any and all interested Americans, adults. And we've been focusing mainly on helping them understand our system is valuable and how it's set up and how that value is created. And we're doing that on the assumption that that understanding can lead to better trust. And we then offer pointers on how citizens can interact with various government offices. And our hope is that that will set the stage for people so inclined to do their own research into how they might act in support of American democracy. And we had some survey data is showing that typically people who have that better knowledge are more participatory and vote more. Time will tell which way causality is flowing, though. I mean, I think we need to be alert and keep track of the actual impact that we're having. I could talk your head off about about that. But moving on to the second question, why trust in democracy has been falling. Well, there's a lot of theories, and I'm not sure there's consensus, but I think probably most people would agree with the following. First, yes, there is a lack of knowledge, and that's definitely part of it. Alongside of that, there has been organized and persistent efforts at disinformation, long-standing in some cases, coming from the former Soviet Union and now coming from existing Russian government, the Chinese government, the Persian government, and others who would like to see American democracy divided and weakened. Poor performance on the part of the government is a very big part of distrust for many people. But in that context, polarization both leads to poor performance through gridlock, and it worsens the frustration each side feels. They feel cheated by the other side. They're getting more than us. Well, that frustration provides easy excuses for all sorts of attacks on elections, attacks on checks and balances, on our liberties and rights. It's not a healthy thing. And if you don't like democracy, disinformation and polarization are great tactics. And frankly, I think Americans should understand they're being manipulated. This is real stuff. It's really happening. So I want to mention a few other bits and pieces, though. Alongside the frustration, there's a certain mindset some people have, for better or for worse. They're just expedient. They want solutions, and they don't care how they get them. If a democratic government can deliver, that's great. If it takes an autocrat to make it happen, that's great. And so their expediency leads them open to giving up their voice and their rights if they believe it's going to lead to better results. And that expedient mindset's definitely evident within the ambivalent audience that we're interested in serving. So all of these topics, knowledge of what's essential to democracy, disinformation, polarization, expediency, we'll hope to address more and more as we go forward, shifting towards our ambivalent audience. Paul, I don't want to put too much emphasis on trust. Some
Okay.
distrust can be a healthy thing. You might remember Thomas Jefferson was alleged to have said eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Well, there's surely something to that. And frankly, that distrust, as I mentioned earlier, has a lot to do with why the framers included checks and balances in our Constitution, as well as civil liberties, civil rights, the rule of law. They knew their leaders might use government to do harm, and they wanted to make that as hard as possible in our new system of government. So I'm probably going on too long, but there's some thoughts in response to your two questions.
No, that's okay. I agree with just about everything there. I would say I think there's a fine line that you can draw between skepticism and suspicion and distrust, and I think a lot of times we unfortunately spill way too much over onto the suspicion side. But you definitely also can't just assume that government is always there to help you out or that everybody's got altruistic motives, because that's just not true. That's not realistic to think. So there's definitely an important point to be saying, well, we can't just outright trust everything either, because that's not going to help anybody either. Ignorance in that scenario is not bliss. But one thing that you did say that I also wanted to expound on, you're talking about that you want people to realize how much they're being manipulated. I think you do. I think people, it's not the issue is not that people don't realize they're being manipulated. I think a lot of people do. I think they just don't understand how it is happening and how their biases are coming into play. They can, a lot of times, conveniently, the manipulation's only coming from people that don't think like them,
Mhm.
And I think, and funny enough, that actually makes you easier to manipulate, because now people that are more similar to you in thinking who can be nefarious actors. Now they know that you're basically going to just believe anything they say, so you can sow distrust about elections that don't go the way you want them to, or that basically everything that they're trying to do is going to destroy this country. And I think that's how there's just this, people realize there's manipulation, but they don't realize just how extensive it is, and they don't really understand how to better protect themselves against it. And I think it goes back to that whole spilling too much over into suspicion and distrust and hate versus being healthily skeptical. But I mean, yeah, that's something that we could go on for hours, and that could be its own episode. I do want to dive more into trust in our political institutions at some point, but I do also want to get to this next question here. So states vary in all sorts of ways in what they teach about civics, how they assess learning, whether it's required in middle and or high school, and so on. And you brought up iCivics earlier in the conversation, and it wasn't. I think it's a organization that is now under their umbrella, and I'm forgetting what they were called, but they had a map of that showed like all sorts of differences in how states handle civics and how they teach it. Do you think that there should be more standardization of civics across all the states and the U.S. territories? And if you do, how much would you say they should be standardized?
Yeah, that's a very fraught question in some ways. I'd like to start out just observing that the Constitution leaves educational policy to the states, and I think we need to honor that. But even if it didn't, I think that we all would benefit from a competition of ideas. So if there were any form of standardization, I'd hope it would be voluntary. And I would propose two things, and your listeners won't be surprised now, because I've said them over and over, that students first be exposed to the pros and cons of democracy compared to anarchy and authoritarian government. And second, that they should be made aware of the many ways that government institutions can be bent to serve one person or one family or one faction at the expense of others. So they know what to look for. And then they can put that together with Thomas Jefferson's adage to be vigilant. So I think that's where I'd leave it.
Yeah, it's a good microcosm, I suppose, of the whole debate about what should be in the purview of federal and state governments. Yes, there should be a lot of. I'm very reluctant to employ a one-size-fits-all kind of policy when it comes to education, but at the same time, there are some concepts that you really wish that everybody knew. But how do you go about implementing that? And then should you basically force people to, for lack of a better term, force people to abide by that? It's a like you indicated, it's a very fraught or delicate balance to strike there, and it's definitely not any easy answers to that. Some of the courses you've had on there, I like some of the approaches you've had, and you're not just the courses on the CFFAD website are not just about, oh, well, these are the three branches of government, and this is what this agency does. No, some of them are more like, well, what is corruption? And more, not necessarily in the weeds things, but some more unusual concepts that are not necessarily in civics. And it would be nice if those things were implemented more in civics education around the country. But once again, you have to be careful with, dictating what the state should and should not teach. But I think that really is a good segue into the next question, because obviously there is a lot of hyperpartisanship and harsh ideological rhetoric going on in today's politics and discussions in general. But do you think that civics education in America specifically also has problems with being used to promote partisan or ideological views rather than the fundamentals of our democracy?
Yeah. Maybe I just want to make one more remark about your last question. With 50 states, each one different from the other, it's happy for me when they want to sort of extol some of the things that make their states special. So I just wanted to make a note that's another good reason for not imposing too strict standards. It's an amazing country that we live in, and I think people need to know that. But coming to the partisanship and whether civics is used maybe as a weapon in partisan battles, well, yeah, I mean, from the outside, it does look like that. That's happening. And I think because I'm old enough now, I can look backwards. I think it's sort of long been true, and maybe it's only natural in a country like ours. We have so many people from so many different kinds of backgrounds with so many different kinds of perspectives and needs. So perhaps to some extent, we should expect that there will be always a contest about what should be taught in civics and in many other topics, frankly. But I think you're right to put your thumb on the important point that it's not a good idea to let partisan fights obscure the fundamentals. And I say that because power shifts from time to time. Power alternates. And it is in the interest of every partisan, no matter which side you're on, to maintain some of the fundamental institutions of American democracy. People and parties on the losing end of the stick in any given moment need to know that they can compete again and again in the future in fair contests. And that kind of assurance only comes when you have accountable representation, checks and balances, civil liberties, civil rights, rule of law, federalism, and all of that backed by a written constitution. These things protect everyone, no matter which side you're on. So, yeah, have your partisan fights. Sometimes those fights can be very productive, even. Sometimes they're fights worth having, but don't throw out the things that protect you.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one thing that we sometimes say around here is don't give your leaders more power than you tolerate in your opposition. So, yeah, over to you.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when you think of going back to the whole, it's okay if my side is authoritarian. And it goes, at some point in time, you give your side too much power. Now your side is going to try to dictate the future of your side. And now you're going to start splitting off. And now you used to be on the winning side, and now you may be under the thumb of people who now get to dictate government policy or how civics should be taught. And now suddenly maybe you regret those actions, or maybe you don't see your own part in how that happened. And I mean, obviously a lot of people think that it's not their side being partisan, it's the other side being partisan. And conveniently, or funny enough, that is also partisan itself. But yeah, I think there's a, not just, obviously, I mean, I do think that there's partisanship and ideology that seeps into civics education too much, but maybe civics education also needs to include ways to be able to spot that. But I think you do also bring up a good point that that's not necessarily a new thing either in civics, that's been a thing that's happened before, and it's been a thing that we've had to discuss and deal with before. And a while back, I had a guest on here. His name is Alex Vassar, and he was talking about the preservation of political information because he has this database about California political history, and it's a really fascinating thing he's built over there. And we got onto civics, and he said something that really has stuck with me to this day. And basically, he said that civics is about our relationship with our government, and teaching government is more about the simple facts of how it all works. And over time, the education has been trending more towards government rather than civics, and basically felt like that might be a reason why fewer people seem to care about civics these days. So do you see that as well? Do you think that civics education is missing that relationship between citizen and government, or do you see it differently?
Mm, I might see it a little differently. I think most civics textbooks have pretty strong sections on how students can and should participate in our government and what some of their obligations are in that regard. And I don't think that that's changed much over the last many decades. So if that's relationship, if that's what he's talking about, I think that that's been there and is still there. But what I'm seeing and our organization is seeing is that, and well, those of you who are listening who are in the civics profession will be shocked by this at all, but the share of students who get access to a good civic education had been falling since the 1970s, really. A lot of people lost faith in government, um, either because of or during the civil rights battles and then Vietnam and Watergate. And then there was a push to move education towards science and technology and away from the arts, and civics lost out in that fight as well. And it's only recently that access to civics has started to improve again. So there's been several lost decades there. And even where it's improving in terms of access, a lot of it's still quite superficial. A few states even only require that their students pass the 100 questions in the citizenship test. And if you ever look at that citizenship test, those 100 questions, not a single one directly addresses the value of American democracy and how that value is created. So superficial and generally lacking in any discussion of the pros and cons of democracy versus authoritarianism and authoritarian tactics. So yeah, so I think I'd put the emphasis on things other than the participatory role of, because that's there.
Gotcha. I guess I kind of see it a little bit from both perspectives. I feel like, but at the same time, that's also a good point to bring up. Is a lot of it is just the pure access to civics just hasn't been there, and maybe they just really, it's not so much that they haven't been taught their relationship to government for some people, but more just that they haven't even had the opportunity to have that be taught to them. But it still was something that I thought was a very intriguing point of view. And since it's been a while since I had that interview with Alex, I might have forgotten some of the nuances of his answer too. But it does feel like sometimes when people talk about civics, it's more just rote facts about government rather than the essence of why all this stuff matters. And maybe that's more of kind of what I'm trying to get at. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is we kind of assume that it's self-explanatory why this stuff matters, but if you just assume that it's self-explanatory why democracy is the route to go, why the American system of government, despite all its flaws, still works, then eventually people are going to start questioning it and say, well, you know what, this actually isn't working, instead of having all the information that we just took for granted be taught to them before. And so a couple more questions before we wrap up. An intriguing article on the CFFAD website that I came across was this proposal of 6 points that tend to be, well, actually, it looks like it's actually more like 7, but 6 or 7 points that tends to be missed but should be added to civic education for all ages. Now, obviously, all of those are important. That's why you have them on this article. But I wanted to see if there are any that you would especially stress, and could you expound upon them?
Okay. When I think about that, I find it hard to stick to just 2 or 3.
Doesn't have to be your favorites, just 2 or 3 that right now you want to expound on.
Yeah. Well, so the first, I suppose, would be that people have to accept that there are always going to be people who disagree in any society. They're going to disagree on what the problems are. They're going to disagree on how to solve the problems. So they're going to disagree on what's fair and what's just. Any place, anytime. Take Iceland. It's one of the most ethnically pure countries in the world, but they disagree on all kinds of things. Taxes, whether to stop whaling or not? Who should profit from their cheap geothermal energy? How much tourism to tolerate? All kinds of things to argue about. Second, governments are created. They are created, and they're created by people to make decisions for their society. And sometimes the people making governments are elites. Sometimes they're the people with the most guns. Sometimes they're just ordinary people. Sometimes those governments are created to solve problems and disagreements in ways that most citizens can support. And sometimes they're created just to impose solutions, regardless of what people think. But because governments are created by people, no form of government is permanent. Opportunistic people are always going to be trying to bend the rules to their advantage. And I remember at the beginning of our discussion together, you mentioned the Federalists and the Democratic Republican Party. I just want to use that as an example. So not long after the American government was established under the new Constitution, the government was run by the Federalists. John Adams was the president, and he did not have much tolerance for dissent. And he felt that because we were at the time engaged in a low-level conflict with France over trade, that dissent was dangerous, in his opinion. And he and his supporters in Congress passed an anti-sedition law. And they did this despite the fact that the Constitution included the Bill of Rights and free speech. Well, they're bending the rules to their advantage. They don't want to hear dissent from the Democratic Republican Party. People were jailed. There's a congressman from Vermont who accused President Adams of having a thirst for ridiculous pomp. And a newspaper editor who defended that congressman in print was jailed. A journalist who called President Adams a hermaphrodite was jailed. An ordinary citizen who was caught saying that he hoped President Adams would get hit in the rear by a cannonball was jailed. You know, these things sound ridiculous, but they really happened because somebody in power and their supporters didn't want to tolerate dissent. So those are three. I got to toss in the fourth, which is if governments are created by people and no form of government is permanent, then what form of government is best? We hope to convince you that the legislative debate and compromise in the American system of government, at least as it's supposed to be, is far better than absolute monarchs, dictators, military juntas, theocracies. I just want to toss out some reasons why. Democracies tend to be less corrupt, and I know a lot of people are very upset by government corruption. They are more inclusive of all peoples in their territory. They are better at problem solving, and for a variety of reasons, but the stability, the openness of democracies are just naturally facilitative of a lot of innovation that you won't find in lesser countries. Democracies tend to be more stable, less violent. They offer more amenities, and they're just generally richer and happier. So all things worth having. So those are the four. I know you wanted only two or three, but
that's all right. I will say one that, I mean, obviously they all speak to me, but something that I think is really not. I think most of these people theoretically would agree with. Now, whether they actually do, because some people, like we just talked about, like with John Adams and people in general, they say, oh yeah, we should be able to disagree, but they get really upset if people disagree. But something I think a lot of people really don't truly accept is the fact that there's inevitable trade-offs. Even within democracy, there are always trade-offs. When you debate policies, there is any policy you come up with, it's made by human beings, it involves human beings, it applies to human beings. There's something that's going to be wrong with it. There's always something that's going to be a fault, and you just won't be able to fix everything. And so you have to debate between multiple things. And I think you see that a lot with, it's one of the things that I really get frustrated with ideologues about, is just because ideology likes to package things up very neatly and say, well, everything can be fixed and explained by capitalism, socialism, communism, conservatism, liberalism, anarchism, fascism, whatever the case may be. But there's always going to be something wrong with it. And some of them are a lot more wrong than others, like fascism, for example. But democracy, for all its flaws, and it has many flaws, it can be very slow, it can be inefficient, it can sometimes still lead to a bad policy, but it's far better than what you're going to get with any other system of government, like you said. And people want to focus so much on the flaws of something they don't like, and then minimize flaws of a policy that they do like. And it's something that I find very frustrating. And I'm not going to pretend like I haven't done that myself, because I definitely have. We all have our biases, but I think it's just something that is just so, the fact that there are trade-offs with basically everything you do, or opportunity costs. Since you're an economist, you think of it in the sense of opportunity costs. That's what you're always going to have something like that involved. And I think that's something that does need to be emphasized more, not just in civics, but just in general.
Mm-hmm.
But we are coming up near the very end. I do have one more question after this, but let's go ahead and get to this. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave us about civic education or making a fair and accountable democracy, and how can viewers and listeners help out the CF?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was wondering if I could try to end on a little bit of an optimistic note.
For sure.
So, in just the same way that governments are made by people, I want to observe that polarization is also made by people. It's something manufactured by people who see little use for collaboration or compromise. But when you accept that these things are driven by people who have some purpose in mind, it should be a little bit easier to imagine that we, ordinary people, also have the power to unmake polarization and to improve American democracy. In that spirit, I want to give you the other half of the John Adams and the anti-sedition story. Your followers might be interested to learn that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who were at each other's throats, not only over the anti-sedition and the trade wars, but many other things. They both died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1826, having become friends again for the last 15 years of their life. And that came about through the efforts of their mutual friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush. He didn't say, well, they just hate each other and it's so sad. He did something about it and led to wonderful things, true friendship, to their dying day on the 50th Declaration of Independence. So that's something to think about on Independence Day. I know it's also all about family and fireworks, and those are very important, but let's also think how we want to conduct ourselves in our independence. So that's how I might leave it. As to how people can help us, well, we welcome volunteers, we welcome partners, and especially we'd love to know if anybody else is out there already addressing the ambivalent audience, already helping them conclude in favor of democracy successfully or unsuccessfully. We can learn from each other. So volunteers, partners, all in. And we're grateful, Paul, for this opportunity.
Sure, and I'm thankful for you for coming on here. And yeah, I that's something I look back to and sometimes cite is John Adams and Thomas Jefferson being such great friends. They were founding fathers, and then they were torn apart by politics, and then they eventually came back together. And you look at just how many people are being torn apart, friendships are being severed, familial relationships are being disintegrated. Stories like that in a time where communication was much tougher than it is now. It's something that you can look back to say that these severed relationships don't have to be that way for the rest of their of people's lives. And so I appreciate you bringing that part up.
Yeah.
So to wrap things up here now and to be on another lighthearted note. So for anybody who's new to the podcast and for previous listeners, whenever I have a guest on, I like to have a random, fun, non-political question just to get a different side of our guests. And also, they're just weird questions that I just think about sometimes. So, Doug Addison, today's random question for you is, which U.S. president had the best hair? And that can be facial and or top of the head.
I have never, ever thought about that before.
No?
Never. I'm just thinking the founding fathers often wore wigs.
It's also true.
So we may not have the best idea of there may have been baldness or something going on underneath there. So I think Grant had a nice photo.
Grant did have a very sick beard. I gotta hand it to him for that. That's a good choice. I believe James Garfield was also one who had a similar beard. Did he? I had to look at him again, but I think he had some photos of that too. Now, for my money though, just for out of pure uniqueness, is I gotta hand it to Mr. Martin Van Buren. I know his presidency is not necessarily remembered the most fondly because of the panic of, is it 1837, I think? But boy, those mutton chops, those are very hard to beat. I don't know many people that can pull that off these days. But those sideburns, those mutton chops he had, those are pretty incredible. So I gotta hand it to him there. I would never try that out myself, but.
There were some etchings of Teddy Roosevelt in his youth had some pretty good mutton chops.
Yeah, and Teddy Roosevelt he's got to have specifically the best mustache that any president has ever had. So, yeah, got to give that to him for there. But
well, I thank you for that question.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Not that more in the future.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, those are just things I think about sometimes. But sometimes politics gets a little too serious. Sometimes you just need something that's a little different. But I appreciate you humoring me with that question. So I will, in the show notes, I will obviously put the CFFAD website. I'll also put the link to that question about what we should add to civics. I'll also add that. Are there any other links that you would like me to put in the show notes?
Yeah, well, there's a second post related to what should we add to civics a week or two ago. So you could put the two of those together if you like. And then, the link to our courses. And we also have a glossary of terms. They could just catch that through the general website, or you could give the links directly as you wish.
Okay. I'll add those then. As for my links, my several works that I have, my 5-day educational email course about how we can all better mitigate polarization and toxicity in this country, my first book, well, it's planned to be, or currently the only book I have, but hopefully soon to be the first book that I've had. My book on independents and why they struggle so much in elections and how they could possibly become more competitive. That is on Amazon and several other retailers. I'll have the links for that as well. And my writings on medium.com. And then for my other links, my LinkedIn, my Facebook, my website, paulrader.org, and my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com. And that's going to wrap things up for us on this end. Thank you so much again for coming on, Doug, and for you at home for listening and watching. And we'll see you next time.